joining us early in the morning. Again, I've posted the notes document in the right here, so we'll be referencing the agenda that I've started to develop. This conversation is just going to be about the Ohana API and the Ohana code base. We'll go around and do introductions. Please share a little bit about if you've worked with the Ohana API, in what context. And let's also get right from the introductions started on shaping an agenda. If you have specific questions, let's go ahead and note them right off the bat, or topics that you want to discuss. Obviously, since it's only an hour, there's going to be we're not going to be able to talk about everything, and so we're going to have to use some discretion in figuring out what's something that we can discuss, or what's an open agenda item for future discussion. But go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know what topics or questions you have, if any. I can go ahead and point fingers going left to right. Declan, you're all the way on my left, so why don't you go? Declan?
Like he's frozen, maybe. Oh, no, there he is.
You guys are breaking up a little. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Hey, everyone. I'm Declan. I'm with Purple Binder. We're an INR vendor in Chicago. We've done a little bit of work with the Ohana API, more with the Ohana web search. And the main thing that I want to talk about, that I like to put on the agenda, is the future of the code base after after this phase of the development, now that the Knight grant is over.
Okay, Matt, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Matt Pope. I'm working with the San Francisco Code for America Brigade on a Ohana implementation with a department of the city of San Francisco. And I've been working on sort of the data transformation side of things. So I'm new to Ohana, and I'm new to Code for America. I'm just new, so in the last month. I don't have any specific questions, but so I'm still getting kind of ramped up. But I'm sure I'll have them as we talk.
Yeah, well, Matt, I have your suggestion from a conversation on Slack about versioning.
Yeah, sort of more as sort of a comment. I mean, obviously, I'm like I said, not experienced with this system, but yeah, sort of a comment about how do we ensure consistency through change in the schema and change in the code base with such a great disconnected API and kind of front end setup. So.
Okay. And let's have Moncef go last. Volkan, go ahead. Welcome.
Hi, my name is Volkan. I'm a programmer based in New York, and I've helped one organization so far, NYC Prepared, to set up an instance of Ohana, and I've set up an instance myself for my own personal project, an education related project, and sort of taught a lot about how to extend it to the education space, and the problems and challenges of that space and how to make the schema compatible with it. So what I'd like to talk about, and I've also taught a workshop on Ohana recently, and I've had some useful feedback, especially about the UI and sort of usability of the admin interface. So I'd like to talk about that.
Usable, say that again?
Usability of the admin interface.
Okay, right. Do you want to actually, should we set some time during this conversation, if we have it, for you to share a little bit about that feedback and talk about it?
I mean, it was just really general feedback. I think the admin UI, many people felt that it was organized too much around the data and not around the sort of use cases. And I've been getting sort of a lot of support requests in the last couple of weeks about, how do I do this, how do I do that. So yeah, I mean, admin interface could be more helpful.
Okay, let's. I'm going to add that. I think that may. We'll talk a little bit about that, but in the context of like the future of the code base conversation, as issues come up, how do we want to discuss them? Jeffrey just joined us again. Jeffrey, I think you're the one person on the call who I'm not sure that you've actually worked with Ohana, but you're welcome to join us. But go ahead and share a little bit about your experience so far and what whether you have questions for us. Jeffrey? I know Jeffrey earlier was able to get sound but no video, and now he may have video but no sound. So, Jeffrey, while you figure that out, we're going to go ahead and get started with Moncef's introductions.
Yeah, so I've been working on Ohana since for almost 2 years now, I guess. Started out as a project during Code for America Fellowship, and then I got a Knight grant, which allowed us to take it from the prototype stage to something that would be easier to deploy, because it was originally built for San Mateo County, so we wanted to take out all the hard-coded stuff and make it more generalizable, more easy to customize. And we only had 1 year, actually a little bit less than a year. So obviously we couldn't. Hi, Jeffrey.
Did you hear me?
I can hear you.
Now we got you.
We got it working. Okie dokie. That's all I wanted to settle. All right. Okay. I had to switch browsers. That's what I had to do.
All right, go ahead, Moncef. We'll get back to Jeffrey.
Yeah, that's fine.
So the main goal over the past year was to make it more stable, more robust, and our message was always that it was as an alpha product. So it hasn't reached 1.0 yet. To speak about the versioning, we actually already have released 3 versions so far, 0.1, 0.2, and 0.3, which kind of like represented the real big changes. Originally it was a MongoDB application, and then we made a switch. It was using MongoDB and Elasticsearch, and then we replaced both of those with Postgres. So that was a big change, and so we released a new version for that. But since then, we haven't really been releasing different versions because it didn't really make sense, because we were constantly making changes and updates, and that was the message that we're using semantic versioning, where anything that's below 1.0 means that anything can change at any time. And so once we say, okay, here's 1.0, then obviously we're going to be continuing to use semantic versioning such that if there are any breaking changes, we'll have to update the major version number, and keep using that kind of strict versioning. And as far as the versioning of the API itself, the code base already supports that, but so far there isn't, there is no 1.0, so everything right now is still version 1 of the API. And so changes to the API that would require us to move to like a version 2.0 would be things that would break clients. Like if you remove a field that they rely on or something. I think addition of fields shouldn't be considered a breaking change, because then they just can consume that if they want. And so that's why right now we're still trying to figure out all the fields, because the spec has been changing the way they name certain fields, and I've been updating the API. So once everything's settled, once the spec releases their 1.0 version, then I'll make sure all the field names match, and then I'll declare the API 1.0, and then obviously any changes after that will use versioning. So it's already set up to use that.
That's great.
Yeah, and So I've been for the code-based versioning, I've been using GitHub's releases section, but maybe it might be better just to have like a change log, because maybe not everybody knows to look in the releases section. I mean, there's different ways to do it, and I guess having it in a change log keeps it within the Git repo versus like just tied to, because the releases is just a GitHub thing, so it's and so like the admin interface, it was everything is just an MVP, so we just wanted to allow people to at least be able to make changes to the existing data. But I have a big list of things that I'd like to build out that we just didn't have time to build over the past year. But there's obviously various things we can add and can improve based on feedback, and some of them are little things that I've been adding when I can, but things that might take longer, since right now I'm not doing this full time anymore. It just might take longer, but I know that Code for America is looking to get a technical lead to help build things out. So I guess one thing we haven't discussed, or that's not clear yet, is like who decides what gets built and when. Like, is this going to be like a full-on project or project manager and priorities? Do we set things that like label things in GitHub to manage milestones and sprints, things like that? Is it going to be that kind of project, or is it going to be more ad hoc? But I'm still very much involved and want to keep working on it. It's just I can't do it full time anymore, so certain things might take a little longer. So one thing I'm planning on doing, in the near future is, well, first of all, just making sure the fields match the spec. But as you might have heard, there's a big change that happened in the spec, is that it uses a end-to-end relationship between services and locations, whereas the API just uses one-to-n. And so I just want to get feedback from people as to whether, if they really need an end-to-end schema in the API itself, because as far as I understand it, most people have voiced their desire to have that mainly to facilitate data administration in the admin interface. For example, make it easier to say that this service belongs to many locations. This service is available at several different locations.
So Moncef, we're gonna review this issue in depth. I want to pause on it though.
Sure.
I've been taking notes, and that was a great introduction to it. But we'll come back to it and do a little bit of recap. That very well may be like the next thing after we get a sense of one more sense of like where folks' questions are and what issues what else we want to address other than that big juicy one. We had a couple other folks. Before I kick it to the other couple folks that joined us, Moncef, I got a little bit of sense of this, but I want to loop back and say, do you have questions for the folks on the call? And if you have one right off the bat, that's great. But like, do we want to ask questions of these folks that we can make sure to make time for in the conversation?
Well, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that that they feel free to ask any questions on GitHub and open issues. That's my preferred way to communicate. That way, everything is in the open, and people can search, and see if they have to come up with the same issue, they can just look up at the issues and then see if it's already been resolved. Versus having it in different parts, like here's a Google Doc, here's this. It's just, since it's related to the code base, just do everything in GitHub.
Okay.
So if there's something that's not clear, or whether it's documentation issue or something you came across while deploying, just open an issue and we'll resolve it there.
Great. And we'll be sure, I'm taking notes. I would love anybody else, if you want to get in there on the notes and add your own without waiting to speak it, go ahead. We'll translate everything from the notes that's really salient into GitHub issues after the call. All right, Jeffrey and Devin, you want to introduce yourselves, and then we'll review what we have left to talk about?
Okay, I'm Jeffrey, and I'm a software developer by profession, and I don't know what else to say. I looked somewhat at the product, and so I remember him mentioning Postgres. I did observe that was the back end for the thing, but I didn't get much further in that. I just got it a day or two ago.
Okay. Do you have any questions for us on this call, or you're just here to listen?
Not at this juncture.
Okay.
I was a little surprised to hear you moved it from Mongo to Postgres, but that was just, I'm surprised at that.
So maybe you and Moncef can talk about that offline, because that's well behind us. Devin, welcome.
Hi guys, how's everyone doing?
Great.
Okay, so I manage some resources related to Superstorm Sandy in New York City, and we've been kind of using Ohana and engaged, to some extent in the open referral conversation. Vulcan put up our installation, so thanks, Vulcan. And and we're kind of like a grassrootsy operation. We're kind of a group of people at different organizations that are just trying to make like a decent service directory for like a specific segment of the New York City public. Like no one, so we're kind of getting the data where we can type outfit. We have to, a lot of our work relies on using the admin interface, as such, and it's not just like clean data dumps in. So we kind of, I guess I have that experience, the experience of that. And I think that's probably a good intro. I could ramble on.
Do you have questions that you'd like, or topics that you'd like us to talk about that haven't been mentioned so far?
Not really. I want to thank Moncef for producing a decent piece of software, and also I want to, I guess, salute him for really managing the GitHub as a communication platform really well. I see a lot of projects, and I think this is my favorite in terms of how people like communicate issues over GitHub, how they get linked and merged, and how I think it's a really great communication medium. So I just encourage folks to use that when possible. Aside from that, I'll listen for a bit, and
awesome.
Then I'll pipe up when I feel the need.
Great. Okay. Thank you everyone for the introductions. If you'll, you've been seeing, I've been taking in the notes some of the issues that we have. First, there's this matter of the relationship change between locations and services that's happened in the open referral spec. And this very well may be like the majority of the time that we want to spend is talking through this issue, discussing what our options are, pros and cons of those options, what else we need to know, and how to move forward on that one. So that's definitely, like, I'd like to make sure that we spend as much time as we need on that, because it's a significant one. But we also definitely want to talk about the future of the code base, even though that will mostly be the start of a future conversation. I think we do want to actually get really substantially through the one-to-N, end-to-M conversation on this call, whereas the discussion about what happens with Ohana in this next coming chapter, we're just starting to think about that, and so hopefully you all can help us set that agenda, essentially. And then we also had some other issues with like the usability of the admin UI that came up that Vulcan mentioned. And that may be the kind of thing that we bring up in the context of that conversation about the future. Maybe we can hear a little bit about what Vulcan was saying and think about what that means in terms of new features and how much labor would go into those new features and how we decide moving forward how to make those decisions. And then hopefully at the end we'll have some time for any other questions and next steps. Oh, actually, I did get some feedback from the Miami call that we'll tack on to see if we have additional time after 1M and the future conversation. Someone in Miami who's deploying the software there asked whether there's future plans to merge the Ohana web search into the API application, because there used to be 3, and then there were 2, and he's asking whether there would someday potentially be 1. And he also asked some questions about automating the process of exporting your local data to Heroku, and something else. Let's see if we have extra time to get to those. They're there in the doc. And if you're bored and you want to just like chime in the text rather than video chat, go ahead. So with that aside, let's go ahead and talk about the one-to-many and the one-to-n locations to services conversation. If I may, I'll sort of frame the conversation and then kick it to Moncef to talk about the implications for Ohana, and then kick it back to you all to weigh in. So we had a long-standing conversation over the course of the development of the open referral specification. It came in waves about the relationship between services and locations. The Ohana API was designed in which every location could have many services, but any given service would only belong to one location. And others observed that...
That's not entirely correct, but...
Oh, okay, no, please correct it, please, help me.
So the difference between one-to-n and n-to-m is that in one-to-n, if you want to have the same service in multiple locations, you just have, so let's say like in the current admin interface, you'll have to recreate the same service at every location. So it's just like a more manual labor. But there's a way to solve that in the admin interface. You can just build a new feature that automatically copies the fields to all the different locations. And so, you know, my thinking is that we want to keep the admin interface as simple as possible, not make any like drastic changes. And the way an app like Ohana API is designed does not necessarily have to reflect the spec. You know, it's just an app implementation. Any app can design a schema however they want, as long as the data is there and it's manageable. So, and this issue really only would affect people who are like try to import directly from their existing data source that uses n2m into Ohana, using the existing import tool, because the import tool just uses the existing schema in Ohana API. So, so for those people, there would have to be some kind of translator that like transforms the data from n2m into one-to-n to make it easily importable.
I just want to make sure that other folks who may have not been paying attention to the whole conversation can get a sense of it before we jump into those options. But that was a helpful clarification. So the issue was that many folks, especially those who work with systems that are, you know, actively serving many people, they suggested that services and locations should have a many-to-many relationship. Declan offered a specific proposal that I can let him talk about more that would establish a table that would hold, I believe, the information about services that are specific to their location. So that a service could, the information about a service that's sort of general to that service, even if it's offered at multiple places, would be in that service's sort of record, but then there'd be a table, service at location, I believe, that would hold location-specific data. And Moncef's point to this, which sounds like a valid concern, is that that's more taxing on the processing. It's slower, requires an extra lookup for every query, and also that it potentially is more unwieldy to design the relationship between services and locations that way for the purpose of data entry. And so that's my best overview, really briefly, of this very technical issue that we went back and forth on. Does anybody have questions about like the nature of the issue before we talk about the implications for the Ohana API and what to do about Ohana moving forward? Or do we feel like we pretty much covered it and now we're ready to talk about what to do? Okay. So moving on, as far as I can see, we've identified two different options. One is the schema might need to be changed, and which is going to require a significant amount of work to essentially rebuild. And then the other, which Moncef has suggested, is the development of a translator that would enable data that's structured in many-to-many relationship between services and locations to be transformed into this one-to-n relationship within Ohana. And that's two separate projects. One is writing the translator in, and the other is writing the translator to push it out. Is that correct, Moncef?
Well, not necessarily, because so there's another thing I'm working on building is a CSV export tool, so you can just from the admin interface, export all the different tables. So if you export the data in one-to-n, it's compatible with n-to-m. So if somebody wanted to see a service at different locations, that data will still be available in that export in the CSV file. So the data integrity is retained. So there's no need to transform the data out. And again, the translator would only be helpful for people who are already working with an end-to-end schema and need to import it into the database. So if, for example, if somebody's creating data from scratch, like using a spreadsheet, I don't know if anybody's seen, but we have created a template that people could use to basically produce CSV files that are compliant with the open referral spec that you can then use to import into Ohana API. And the template that I designed was built for those people who are actually going to be doing it manually, because people who are just going to be scripting it, they don't need a template. This is mainly people who might have to create data from scratch, in their community. If they don't already have this kind of data, they're going to enter it manually in a spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet is designed for the easiest way to enter it manually, and it's compatible with Ohana API. So if you use a template right now, there's no need to do any translator or anything. It just works out of the box. So the translator is only for those people who are scripting, converting, doing their own transformation. They're already working with an end-to-end data set, and they need to be able to produce CSV files that work with Ohana. So in that case, they'll have to convert it to one-to-n.
Okay. So again, to recap, we have these two options that we've identified. There could be others. Either a change in the schema or what Moncef is advocating, which is translators, a translator to enable HSDS data to be converted into this format. And again, this isn't necessarily a decision that we're making forever. The question is, how are we going to ensure that in this next upcoming cycle of pilot development, where in many cases Ohana is being used as a tool to test and demonstrate what's possible, the question is, how do we enable most effectively, most efficiently, compatibility between HSDS and Ohana in a way that works for our users? So Moncef, unless you have anything else to add, I'd just as soon go around one by one and see if folks have thoughts and or questions for us about this.
I've got some thoughts, sort of random, newbie thoughts. So I do think that the schema should reflect the way that the data appears or is sort of understood by the user. So I do think that it can be accomplished through a process in the admin UI or through an import process that splits the data out. Or merges the data together, or something behind the scenes. But I do think that in the end, that's really kind of just a Band-Aid on top of the issue. Although I think it's a reasonable, viable Band-Aid, and maybe would satisfy the needs in the short term. I don't know if it really addresses the issue in the long term, though, in the best way. I do think, and I can see that it'll have a large impact on the existing code base and on a lot of people, and so I think there's maybe the question of whether it should happen, or this use case needs to be supported, and that sounds like yes, it does. then the question of how it should be implemented comes up, and I do think that probably a schema change is the sort of long-term right way of dealing it from a data perspective.
Can you elaborate on which users are you speaking about? The admin interface users or the people who are like using the web search to look up the services?
Well, the admin users should. So you're talking about, if I understand it, Moncef, having a layer underneath the admin interface that essentially performs a function on the data that changes its structure from what the admin user is seeing. I'm sorry, I'm not. So they see it one way, but it's actually stored in a different way because there's a process in between that's splitting, essentially copying the data and then maintaining two records of the same data. If you have a data system where you're maintaining two records of the same data, then you should probably have increased the degree of normalization and store that data once, right?
Right. So the issue here is that the services that we're talking about are not exactly the same from location to location. So if everything was exactly the same, yes, end-to-end would definitely make sense. But because there could be up to, I counted, I think it was like 40%, at least 40 to 50% of attributes could be different from one location to another. So there will only be like about half of attributes that would be the same. And so that adds another level of complexity and querying, because now every time you look up a location and you want to see the services, first you have to see, well, does this service belong in multiple locations, and does it have different attributes? Which one is the correct attribute? So even for locations that only have one service, you still have to perform that lookup. And from the data sets that I've looked at, the amount of organizations that have multiple locations is very small. Like in San Mateo County, it's 8%. So for me, it's just technically does not justify to increase the complexity for a small amount of data that would only be using this.
Okay.
That's the way I see it. It's because there's this additional layer of having to compare to see which attributes are the same.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think, and in terms of like the admin interface user, I think as long as they're able to see that it's the same service in different locations, and then be able to see which attributes are different, I think it would be fine. But I guess we'd have to do more testing.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I guess I didn't realize that they are mostly or half the same data record. So it's not a complete duplication of the same data record. It's really, I mean, they really are two different unique records. Yeah, it's really a philosophical conversation,
Yeah. So for me, that's why I've said they're both correct solutions. It's just to me, like, since we already have one-to-N, to me, when I'm comparing, like, if the main goal is to be able to make it easy for admin interface users to assign the same service or at least certain attributes of one service to multiple locations, there's two different ways to do it. It seems to me it's easier to just build in a feature in the admin interface that copies the data versus having to increase the complexity and do these additional lookups when only, like, when duplication is a small fraction of the total data in the database. That's the way I see it.
So this was a helpful overview. I do want to give everybody a chance to sort of speak, say if they have any questions, and rather than make every single one a back and forth, let's see if we can get a sense of it, how everybody's seeing things, and see if there are other points that haven't come up yet, and then we'll dive into more discussion.
Yeah. So can I jump in for a second here, Greg?
Yeah.
So I'll say that my background coming into this debate is having dealt with this question for 3 years at Purple Binder with the data that we maintain. And like, I think everyone has said that it is to some extent a philosophical debate. It could be modeled either way. But what really tipped the equation for us was Matt's point that the data should correspond with the way that the users are thinking of it. And so in our case, the real users are the data administrators, the people who are maintaining this content over the span of years. And we've found that they tend to when they're describing their own world, say that a service can be offered at multiple locations. And that's really what influenced it for us in the development of our software. So obviously, there's a lot of inertia behind the way things are currently done at Ohana, so I don't know if that means that it should be changed, but I think that's a consideration.
So let's hear from Devin and Vulcan, who are actually the people on the call who I think, Vulcan especially, have the most experience with the Ohana itself.
So my perspective on this discussion is that it could be done either way, but I think the framework itself is an abstraction over the database. So we are abstracting already. There's really no need to make the correspondence one-to-one, make sure that the application framework reflects every single nuance of the database schema. And I think, as a solution, the thing that Moncef outlined, just copying over the services from one location to another, is a good enough solution. It's easy to figure out, and it's easy to make changes on the current service that you are modifying right now. And I think it should be good enough. But having said that, I'm not a data administrator. Devin might be able to shed more light on that than I am. So.
Devin.
It's I don't have a passionate point really. I think that from the section of service directories that I see, in terms of like the emergency management community, the people who are basically doing like disaster case management and stuff like that, I think from their perspective, they view services as entities in themselves and that they can exist in multiple locations. And so, for what that's worth, I think that is what it's worth. That being said, though, I'm also someone who is looking at implementing the open referral standard into this larger emergency management information management system that we have, and I wish that I had brought this question to the developers of that, which I haven't done, because I wonder if that would add, if one process or another would create a complication for them. But I assume not, because basically they just join. A service would just have multiple facilities, and which should be fine for them. So I'm agnostic. I can't say either way. But I defer.
Okay. So this is a nice balance of perspectives. What I'm hearing, to sort of reflect back, is that among some, there's a deference to design things according to how users see them. There's some sense that in the long run, the Ohana schema should reflect that, but other strong senses that there's a viable, or at least other senses that there's a viable enough solution that can be built into at the interface level to address that need and establish compatibility with HSDS. That's sort of what I'm hearing so far, at least in terms of the balance of thinking between short-term and long-term considerations. Anybody else have other thoughts on this before we sort of wrap that up? Questions? I mean, one of my questions is, like, how do we test some of those assumptions, right? What is it? What would we actually be looking for if we want to go beyond just, gut level, philosophical, blah blah blah? What would a test of this look like? Because that's one thing, one way or the other. Especially if we write a translator to essentially hack compatibility with HSDS, that's still just like for the next cycle or two, how are we going to test whether this is working really or not? What else do we need to know?
Just get a bunch of data admins to try it out and observe them and take notes. You know, just usability sessions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It really is, from the user's perspective, the results are the same, right? It's just it's a development question. How do you develop it? And I think we're probably, it sounds to me like, Moncef, you know better than anyone here, the sort of difference in the level of effort to accomplish it either way. And what I'm getting in part of this is that the level of effort would be a little less in dealing with it through the admin UI versus making a fundamental schema change. So same end result to the user, correct?
Yep.
So
yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's the same end result, so might as well go with the easier solution, the cheapest solution.
Especially if we're at this point in the project where there's a lot, people have a lot of ideas about other things to be, other ways to be enhancing this product, and really limited resources to make those enhancements. So it's a tough spot.
So
yeah, and honestly, in that regard, it's like settling on an HSDS schema for me is just absolutely the most important thing, and maybe that's independent of this, but because I want to expand it into a, I want to basically build that into a new piece of software, or into another piece of software, an existing piece of software, and so just like having resolution, I think, is more important than having the absolute best.
Well, to be clear, we're going to talk about that next. HSDS, there is resolution. It's going to be end-to-end. We didn't get the actual 1.0 out because we wanted to actually get face-to-face and discuss it, but that's, yeah, that is moving forward, so, which is good news. So this was, I think, really good discussion. I do want to spend about 10 minutes talking about what comes next. Vulcan, maybe as a transition, do you want to share some of the feedback that you got about the usability of the admin UI, and then we can have some context, some specific context about talking about like the future of the code base and how decisions are going to be made?
Yeah, I mean, usability-wise, Devin knows this. I've been getting support requests from him and Ian, who works for Devin, about where to find certain things in the admin UI, and we sort of have the sense that it could be more user-friendly. There's a lot of documentation in GitHub right now that addresses many of the issues that users have, but they're in GitHub. And if you're using the admin interface, you sort of want the answers right there. And if they're not there, it feels broken somehow. And so that's the sense that I got from the workshop. And some people commented on, how it looked unfinished and unimpressive. I mean, just by looking at the admin, admin page, it seems like that. There's a lot of data and functionality there, and it needs to be walked through from the admin UI. So I think that would be my feedback, to put the information where the user is.
Say that again?
Put the information where the user is.
Okay. Okay. So given that feedback, I do want to put a little frame on this before maybe kicking it to Moncef and then going around one more time. So the Knight grant funded the Ohana team's development of the API from something that was specific to San Mateo to something that is essentially like now verging from alpha into beta, and for the purpose of being able to redeploy it elsewhere. That grant lasted through essentially this month. Like January was pretty much the end of that term. The Ohana team has been moving on. Moncef is committed to hanging around the repo and also like adjusting, like developing compatibility with HSDS 1.0. But Moncef has another full-time job, which is very exciting, by the way. He's working at 18F at the government. We have this question of what will happen with this product. as people use the product, as more and more users sort of get involved and get invested in it, it increases the scope of possibilities for what's possible in the future, in terms of rebuilding more development capacity, so on and so forth. For right now, what we can say is that Code for America is committed to putting a product lead through their health focus area. And that product lead is going to be developing tools probably in the Ohana code base, but it's going to be focusing on the needs of our pilots, specifically like San Francisco, primarily San Francisco and Alameda, potentially also DC and elsewhere. And those needs are focusing on the use cases in which we have multiple different data administrators in different organizations who are trying to figure out how to collaborate, going from potentially multiple databases in which they're focusing on potentially different, maybe overlapping domains, into an environment where they can actually say, these are the services that we're maintaining, see the history of changes to the services, understand which are the services that actually need attention, and those are the kinds of tools and interfaces that we're going to be developing in the coming cycles. And which may mean that there are other things that we've identified as known issues, requested features that might not fall within that focus area. And there's still the question of how will this thing grow and evolve. Again, we're not going to try to answer it on this call. It's an open question. In fact, what we can try to do here is set an agenda for those future conversations. You can sort of give us a sense of how we want to be asking these questions in the future, who we want to be asking, what are some precedents for thinking through these things, and what are options that you see before us. Moncef, do you want to add anything to that overview? Okay, sounds good. So let's go around again and see what folks say one by one, and then maybe there are some things that we address and other things that we just sort of report out for future conversations.
So our project in San Francisco is building an admin interface, a different admin interface on top of Ohana. So there is, and I came into it, well after that had begun and was along its way, and so I hadn't even seen the official Ohana admin interface until after I'd seen the efforts on this new one. So. I guess just 2 points. I mean, obviously, it does need to be improved, and I totally understand that it is in place, simply so that folks can add the data, which I think it's completely adequate for. It's adequate enough for me to edit the data, probably not for someone who works in an agency to edit it, unless they're pretty savvy. 2, though, I'm sort of concerned about kind of fragmentation, forking and then creation of stuff that's not tied into this kind of single effort. So I'm worried about what we're doing and how that's going to get folded back into the core Ohana code base. But sort of just general concern, and that there does need to be some strong, leadership and kind of guidance to pull these things, to be able to pull these things back in, so that we're not solving the same problem, 5 different ways in 5 different places.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the reasons why the web search is a different app is because it's considered like a client that consumes the API. But to make it easier to maintain, we decided to move the admin interface inside the same app because the API doesn't provide like authentication, like access to users. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I guess I don't know how complex that would be. I assume it wouldn't be trivial, to implement. But to facilitate like external admin interfaces, if somebody wanted to build something, a lot better on their own, it would be a lot easier, I think, if the API exposed users, allow people to sign in, kind of like GitHub, OAuth, or whatever authentication mechanism. So that would be, I guess, one way to do it, or just have, like you said, merge the changes. If somebody's built something that's awesome, that's so much better than what's here now, I'll put that back in and just have people develop the internal admin interface and make it better. Just collaborate and build it out.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense from my perspective.
All right, so we only have a few more minutes before the other conversation starts. Does anybody else want to throw in final comments, agenda items for future discussions? I don't want to cut things off. I am going to have to start opening up the other Hangout channel, though, so I'm not taking as good notes at the moment. Anybody else?
I can answer Miami's question if you want.
Let's take that offline. Let's do that. But I just want to see. I do want to see, like, Vulcan, Devin, y'all are working with this thing. Do you have thoughts about future conversations so that we can sort of revisit with full attention?
Well, I guess you discussed the extending the admin for other use cases. But that's also related to how to extend the open referral spec. So it might be a better time to revisit that at a later date. Okay. Okay, unless there's anybody else, this has been great discussion. I'm going to process some of this feedback. I'm going to share it with the broader Ohana team in Code for America. They're going to discuss with Moncef about the path forward for the short-term cycles of how this is going to be compliant with HSDS. We'll be reporting that back or bringing any final questions to you all. And in the meantime, we'll be setting a conversation, like an agenda. Probably on the next call, we'll talk a little bit about how often we want to have these kinds of conversations and in what particular context. But for here and now, thank you all. One moment for any final thoughts. Anything anybody else wants to say? Great. So I might see some of you on the next call. I'm about to go open that up right now. Thanks for taking the time this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
All right.